So Kate Frieberg is a colleague and very experienced in the work that we are trying to do together. Kate is a Senior Research Fellow at the Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Justice and Governance at Griffith University. Kate is also a developmental psychologist who is co-director on the Pathways to Prevention project that we heard Ross talk about this morning. Kate's work is the ongoing development of the approach that grew out of the Pathways project. This approach focuses on the theory and practice of applying preventative interventions in community settings. This includes attention to the effectiveness of homeschool community group partnerships in the promotion of positive outcomes for children. The work also focuses on issues that relate to the development of integrated systems of support and organisational structures that facilitate collective action. Kate's presentation is titled Creating Integrated Systems of Care for Children and Their Families, and would you please warmly welcome her.
Thanks very much, Di. And I'm going to, so I stick to time, I'm going to try to stick to my notes. But basically, to set things in context for you, I'm going to talk a little bit more and pick up on some of the things that Ross spoke about in terms of the long and winding road that we've been taking on the Pathways to Prevention project over the last 10 years, and also then start to introduce some of the new directions we're beginning to take in recent times. So clearly, you know, as a researcher and a developmental psychologist, I've got a real interest in both understanding and promoting young children's welfare and well-being, and that's why being part of the Pathways to Prevention work over the years has been a great joy to me. But you know, even though it's thrown us up many challenges, that's been part of the fun as well, as Ross has mentioned. So over the years, our work's focused on developing partnerships, mostly with schools and community agencies, in order to provide supportive programs for vulnerable children and their families. But very critically, the frontline work has been combined with research that's focused on understanding the processes of change and evaluation that's focused on improving practice. And it's really been that evaluation work that's helped us to learn and think most deeply about what we need to do to achieve those integrated systems and better outcomes for children. And Pathways as an entity, I think, has provided us with a very strong and vibrant learning organisation and culture to do that in. The Pathways work, as Ross has already mentioned, that slide didn't really work out very well, I'm sorry, has unfolded in a sequence of stages from back in 1999, when the seminal report that Ross mentioned was published, outlining a developmental approach to crime prevention. And it went through to establishing the community partnership for coordinated implementation of a wide range of child and family services in one of the most socially and economically disadvantaged urban areas in Queensland. And during that 10-year implementation stage, we collected a great deal of data so we could constantly review our practice and monitor whether or not we were having, achieving our goals, and what we wanted to know that what we were doing wasn't doing any harm, it was actually doing something positive. And it's been that critical evaluation process that's led us to our current work that Ross has already described, using the CREATE framework to develop a support system for strengthening capacity for collective action around children's needs. From the very start, the work in Pathways has been guided by the philosophy of developmental prevention, and that highlights the importance of acting on what science tells us about the factors that cause children harm and place their longer-term development at risk, but also about the kind of protective factors and conditions that allow children to thrive and do well. Developmental prevention is about working together across many contexts that the children interact with as they grow, and it's also about developing and implementing comprehensive strategies that have a life course perspective. It focuses work around the many mechanisms that contribute and shape children's development as they grow. And most importantly, it's about getting in early to fix problems, to forestall problems rather than waiting to fix them after they've already emerged. So based on that notion of developmental prevention, one of the first and probably I would say one of the most abiding challenge that we faced within the Pathways program was to manage that inevitable tension that rises at the front line when schools and community agencies are faced with trying to find the right balance between the amount of energy they put into the proactive early prevention work and the amount of time they spend focused on the reactive crisis-driven sort of work. And people often ask, how do you prioritise prevention when you're so overwhelmed by crises? But I think the real question we need to ask ourselves is, how do you not do that? And Ross has already provided you with this slide, but I think it's worth repeating. A couple of weeks ago at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, Dorothy Scott provided this information, which shows statistics about the number of children that are known to protection services in Australia. And as Ross mentioned, those figures are out of control. The system's overwhelmed, and it basically that the developmental system that those sorts of things happen in is broken. We have to do something about fixing that. Now, that doesn't mean we want to or can ever neglect the need for treatment and rehabilitation, but we can't stay locked in that reactive cycle either. We have to do something to short-circuit the system. Now, again, thanks to Dorothy Scott, she reminded us that we already know a great deal about the types of factors that contribute to those and other sorts of problems. And we also know, as Ross mentioned earlier in his talk, a lot about the types of problem-solving strategies that can be effectively applied to address those and other sorts of issues. What we do need, though, is more of the kind of visionary leaders who can prioritise prevention. We can't keep accepting that excuse that because of there's a difference between the length of time funding cycles take and the length of time it takes to see the evidence of preventive policies that that prevention isn't an attractive option. We just have to keep not accepting that as an excuse. So what we need, and what we've had to some extent with some of our principals and state service managers within our Pathways project, but we need more of these people. We need leaders with a long-range vision who can think quite broadly and can communicate that vision to motivate others. We need leaders who can seek credibility and not just credit, who can focus on fixing the system and not just fixing the kids, and who can understand the complexity of the issues and help other people at every level of every sector of the system understand the complexity of that broader developmental system that they're all part of. So we need leaders also who actually have the power to facilitate change at the many levels needed to transform the developmental system, from one that, regardless of the rhetoric about joined-up services, really still, to a large extent, remains locked in a process of work organised around single input services with categorical funding. Now, as well as that very strong imperative to focus on prevention, within the Pathways project, we also emphasise the holistic nature of development and how what happens in one time or one area or one part of a child's life is linked to what's happening in other areas as well. So, for instance, when things aren't so good at home, it can affect the way kids behave at school and make them less responsive to learning. So Pathways, as a project, was quite focused on the importance of working in a coordinated way across the key developmental contexts, particularly in Pathways, that's family, school and cultural community. How many minutes? 10 more minutes. Okay. And basically, I don't want you to try to read any of that, but that's to try and give you an idea that the project combined a whole range of different program activities, and it was to an extent tailored to the individual needs of families. And each family participated in a slightly different way, depending on their needs. So they participated in different activities, different members of the family participated, and they, came, the level of contact and the duration of contact differed across families. And we had some real successes over the years. We saw positive outcomes for participating families in terms of the children's behaviour, their social and emotional well-being, their readiness for school, their school performance, and their parents' level of involvement in the kids' learning and their level of efficacy to parent in positive ways. And as Ross mentioned, we measured all of those things. We didn't just think that might have happened, we actually measured it. Now, as Ross has also said, in addition to demonstrating the positive outcomes of the Pathways model, our evaluation approach also forced us to think about what was going on in the challenging areas where we weren't having quite as much success, because what we wanted to know was what it would take to apply the holistic approach on a much broader scale. So in particular, we wanted to understand what supports schools and community agencies need in order to operate as part of a very well-functioning developmental system of care where everybody works collectively. And it was that process that helped us set out the key principles that Ross has already mentioned in the CREATE framework. Now, I don't want to go into this, but there are actually a lot of synergies and overlap between the principles of CREATE and the core conditions of collective impact. But the other lesson I think that we learnt through Pathways is that none of the core conditions of CREATE or collective impact, for that matter, are going to happen by chance. Okay, we have to work very hard to try and make them happen and understand how they happen in order to do that. Now, that really means that we have to be very sincere and open in terms of examining our current practice and be able to recognise where capacity needs to be built and where changes need to be made. But of course, change is really hard, and sometimes when new approaches that capture our imagination come along, we want it so much that we can persuade ourselves that we're already doing it, and that is actually one of the biggest barriers to genuine change. Collective impact, I think, is something that we all want very much, but I do worry that in some instances we think we might be getting closer than we are. And collaboration's another example of that type of phenomenon. And now, of course, it's not necessary to collaborate all the time. There's a whole spectrum of ways of working together that go from coexisting to communicating to cooperating, coordinating, right up through to collaboration. And sometimes, the things on the lower end of the spectrum are just fine, they work well. But if collaboration really is essential, then we need, it really should be guiding everything we do, from the goal setting to the planning, to the resource allocation, to service provision, monitoring and right through to monitoring the effectiveness of our activities. Really, if collaboration is considered essential to achieving our outcomes, we should also have a way of measuring it and monitoring how well we're doing it, so that if we find that we are wanting in certain areas, we can do something about, self-correcting and getting a bit better at doing it. Now, I mentioned collaboration, and I noticed that Ross did too, because that was actually something that we found was quite challenging in the Pathways project, and the gap between the expectation that people would collaborate and the operation of doing it in that area was one of the things that helped us understand very clearly the importance of capacity building. Yep. Okay, really I think that there's, really an unwritten law, or an expectation at least, that people from different sectors and professional disciplines will work together. But that kind of just do it attitude, I think, means that a lot of people are being expected to do something that's quite hard, very hard in fact, without being given any real support. And that often results in frustration and failure to achieve your promised outcomes and an inevitable drift back to doing what you were already doing before. And we did see that to some extent in Pathways. So even when the activities like circles of care that Ross was going to talk about but didn't get a chance to, even when those sorts of activities were set up specifically as a mechanism for collaboration, we found that success was tempered and people struck barriers in their own organisational structures and job requirements that actually work contrary to genuine collaboration. Okay, so in a way it was those lessons that helped us understand that we needed to build capacity for collective action, and that's what we're just beginning to do in a very exciting project that Ross mentioned, which is all about building the translation and support system for the collective approach. And the prevention support system that we're building is going to incorporate a combination of people and practical tools. I won't go into this very much because Ross has touched on this already, but the tools and processes should help the community coalition strengthen the way they identify their priority issues for children and mobilise their efforts and resources to address them. Here's the slide that Ross also used. We're borrowing from the same bank, but the support system is going to include the advice, mentoring and coaching that's going to be provided by the collaboration managers as very skilled staff. Maybe we should be calling them guides or oracles because we're expecting miracles of them. But it's also going to include the resources that Ross mentioned, a compendium of online resources that's going to include video manuals, interactive evaluation tools, communication tools, data management systems, and program information, particularly information about selecting and using evidence-informed practices. So together those resources, both human and electronic, are going to provide the coalitions with practical, very concrete support to develop effective collaborative processes and undertake tasks like community assessment, action planning, and development of evaluation and improvement plans. So just to try and wrap up thoughts for today, I think that on this, throughout the years in Pathways to Prevention, we've learnt very much that big change only occurs when people at all levels, not just the people at the bottom, it has to come from top down as well, are supported to change the way they think, the way they see things, how they communicate with each other and how they work together. I've also learned that we learn a lot by doing, but we actually learn a lot more by examining what we're doing and stopping to think about how we can improve what we're doing. So I think it's really important to be able to foster a safe culture for evaluating our work so that we never stop learning. So I think part of that means that we have to start seeing evaluation as much about improving as just proving. So that's me for today.